Games are a form of art. In art, people often tell stories. Sometimes more abstract and minimalistic, sometimes more explicit and detailed. Sometimes even a bit too explicit.
Okay, Samus. Everything's normal.
I awoke to the familiar voice of a quarantine officer.
You find all kinds of storytelling throughout many different genres in video games, but one of them is literally all about the narrative: visual novels. As their name implies, visual novels are like books in games format, which means that you get an audiovisual experience to accompany a written story. There's artwork of the characters talking in a scene, background pictures showing you the different locations, a soundtrack that hopefully matches the tone of the situation. If you're lucky, or rather, if the budget was high enough, you might even have some nice animations or voice acting breathing more life into the cast. But all of these are elements that you can also find in other audiovisual storytelling media, like movies and TV shows. I think that the most interesting thing that visual novels can do is to make good use of what is unique to games: interactivity. In this video, I want to talk about the Zero Escape series, a trilogy of visual novels written and directed by Kotaro Uchikoshi. The first game, 999, 9 Hours, 9 Persons, 9 Doors, was originally released for the Nintendo DS in 2010 in the US, and later on went to appear on almost every list of hidden gems in the DS library. This was back when you still had to dig through loads of shovelware in your local game store and didn't hear about every single interesting new game right away on Twitter. Or at least I didn't. It's not that I'm old, I made myself a Twitter account quite late, honestly. In any case, 999 stood out because of its unique and honestly quite aggressive setting. 9 people are trapped inside a cruise ship by a mysterious figure called Zero, who forces them to play the nonary game, a deathly challenge in which they have to open a set of numbered doors, 9 of them, by correctly combining the numbers on the new shiny murder bracelets. Oh, and they have 9 hours to escape until the ship sinks. What starts out like an anime version of Saw, although with less gore, well, a little less, ends up with quite a complex story, serving you a colorful cast, some mind-bending concepts, and pretty amazing plot twists. The Zero Escape series is best enjoyed when you go in as blind as possible. I'm not going to spoil the entire plot, so you will still probably enjoy these games even if you play them after watching this video. Still, I do want to talk about the special storytelling mechanics of these games, and for that, I will have to delve into some details of the narrative that you might want to discover for yourself. So, if you haven't played these games yet, but you are interested, now's a good chance to pause this video, check them out, and come back afterwards to appreciate them together with me. Nowadays these games are quite accessible since you can download them all on Steam. Integrating interactivity in a well-written story is no easy task. A good example of how this can go quite wrong is the pairing mechanic in Fire Emblem Awakening and Fire Emblem Fates. These two Fire Emblem games put a lot of emphasis on the support mechanic, where pairing up 2 characters in battle would allow you to raise the level of their relationship. The catch was that for most man plus woman pairings at the highest support level, the characters would marry and unlock a child unit, which you could later use in battle as adult fighters. While it sounds great on paper, it's like your own playable fanfiction, it messed with the game's narrative. Since you are allowed to pair up your units in a big variety of combinations, all of the characters must be written flexible enough to potentially fall in love with anyone. And when I say flexible enough, I mean empty enough, because in consequence, most characters were limited to a single personality trait, and a lot of dialogues had very little substance. This example shows us that you can't just throw interactivity at your story and expect it to work. Interactivity only works with certain elements of the plot, specifically designed for that purpose, and a big part of the writing in games necessarily still relies on techniques that you might find in other storytelling media. However, what games still can do at all times is mixing up different elements from other media to use them in the most effective way. As an example, take the death scenes in 999. Very early in the game, one of the characters dies in a quite spectacular manner, being blown up by a bomb. The intention here is very clear. You weren't able to develop any attachment to this character yet, so this scene serves for pure shock value and to make clear that the deathly nature of the nunnery game isn't fake, both to the characters and to the player. Now look at how this death is portrayed. You only see a wall full of blood splatters. It's very gory, and the dead character isn't even on screen. Only the violence matters here, not the person who died. The scene is described by the narrator with stomach-twisting comparisons, and the whole sequence is very unsettling. Here the game borrows more from books rather than visual media, describing the details of the dead's remains to you in words, to make your imagination fill in the rest, and force you to get into the mindset of someone who has just witnessed a gruesome death. Now take a look at a death scene much later in the game. If you haven't played the game yet, don't worry, there are different paths and the deaths that occur differ from path to path. So here, this girl dies at a point where both you, the player, and the protagonist have established a connection to her. Therefore, this death scene is more humanized. The girl died from being stabbed instead of being blown up, leaving her body intact so that you can see her lying down almost as if she would wake up at any moment, if it weren't for the pool of blood underneath. What matters here is the tragedy of this character's death, and the narration reflects that, focusing more on the protagonist's feelings upon discovering that she died, rather than any further descriptions of the dead body's details. By the way, I should mention that the PC version of 999 lets you choose between two screen modes. One is called ADV screen and the other novel screen. The ADV screen eliminates a huge chunk of the narration and is practically only dialogue, while the novel screen keeps all of the narration intact. I guess they decided to offer the ADV option since the PC version also has voice acting, unlike the original DS version. This way, playing ADV, you can practically listen to the whole story without having to read. But in my opinion, it's much better not losing out on lots of juicy storytelling details, like with the death scenes, so novel screen is the way to go. But enough about non-interactive stuff. So what does the Zero Escape series do to achieve unique storytelling with interactivity? There are two components in these games that emphasize on that aspect: puzzle escape rooms and branching paths. As I said, interactivity will not just magically work well with your story, and games like 999 understand this well. The Zero Escape games are specifically written with the interactivity in mind, and both elements, narrative and interactivity, serve each other in a symbiotic relationship. The death game plot requires the participants to choose between doors to move forward and solve puzzles in an escape room style. These are facets of the story that favor the interactivity of the player with the game. Meanwhile, the interactivity favors how the story gets across to the player, because they feel engaged, like they're actually making decisions and move along their own path. Let's examine the two interactive components more closely now, starting with the puzzle element. Most visual novels feature relatively little gameplay. Some franchises like Ace Attorney and Danganronpa use the murder mystery formula to provide gameplay by making you act as the detective who has to solve the case. This encompasses investigating crime scenes, talking to witnesses, presenting evidence, and driving a taxi into Mario Kart item boxes to gradually reveal questions that you will answer by picking up the correct girl on the highway. You know, the usual stuff. Zero Escape, however, establishes its own identity by serving you gameplay sections that are like escape rooms, where you collect objects, combine them, interact with them, and solve puzzles to seek a way out of a locked room. While it is true that this separates the gameplay much more from the main story in Zero Escape, as you have literally story sections and escape sections, it also has its advantages. The escape room puzzles feel much more like actual interactive gameplay, and helps you regulate the pace of the nerve-wracking death game plot, giving you a little breather between rather gloomy story events. Despite that, calling these parts only a distraction from the main plot would not do them justice. With the characters being forced into smaller groups into the escape rooms and having to work together, the atmosphere becomes more intimate, with unique interactions that you won't see in the rest of the game, helping to shape and develop the characters' personalities and their relationships. Oftentimes, the escape rooms also have a specific theme, and some characters will feel inspired to talk about eerie philosophical, scientific or pseudoscientific concepts to you. Some of these are just pure infodumps, some are foreshadowing for what is actually happening in the story, but most of them help to maintain and develop the creepy vibe the game is aiming for. Sadly, some of that became lost the more the Zero Escape series advanced. While the escape rooms in 999 were cohesively integrated into the general mood, the next two games had puzzle sections with a more generic and much less contextualized feel to them. The second obvious interactive component are the branching paths within the story. In 999, the specific route that the narrative will follow is determined mostly by the doors you choose to go through. Usually, you will be presented with two possibilities, like here, door number 4 or door number 5. Due to the setup of the death game, choosing one door also means choosing whom you're going to spend time with until you reach the next checkpoint, where the characters will, hopefully, all be united again. And in fact, the specific ending scenario that you will witness depends on the doors you chose, and sometimes also a few dialogue options in between. This is actually a very typical mechanic for visual novels, and honestly, not far off from choose-your-own adventure books. But the Zero Escape series gives an interesting twist to this idea. This is going to be a rather important spoiler for the first game, so now is your last chance to leave. In one of the possible endings of 999, let's call it A, our protagonist Junpei receives a hint on how to obtain a certain password. Once the player has experienced this scene, it is now possible to get to a point in another route, let's call it B, where Junpei needs this password again in order to progress. But in Route B, the events that occurred are different, and they do not lead to him receiving the hint. And just when you wonder how this situation might get resolved, Junpei experiences a sudden flash, and a voice in his head tells him the hint he heard about in Route A. Remember how I mentioned that the good integration of interactivity requires a symbiotic relationship with the storytelling? Well, there you have it. Zero Escape experiments with the meta level of the player's ability to go back and make different choices to see other outcomes. But the story told by the game is affected by the player's interaction. You saw that hint in Route A before, so now you are able to get further in Route B. And this is integrated into the game's story, because the character, Junpei, also knows the hint from having experienced Route 8 before. And actually, once the cat is out of the bag and you realize that Junpei has knowledge of things that happen in alternative routes, it becomes a central element in the storytelling of the Zero Escape series. The sequel to 999, Virtue's Last Reward, had its original release for the Nintendo 3DS and PlayStation Vita in 2012. Again, we have a cast of 9 people that are trapped and forced to play a deadly game to escape. However, this time the death game is based on the so-called Prisoner's Dilemma. At specific time intervals, the characters are put together in groups of 2 opposing parties, where each of them has to cast a vote, either ally or betray. Depending on the results of the voting, the participants will gain points or lose them. The first ones to reach 9 points are allowed to escape. If anyone goes down to 0 points, they die. The main idea is that if the opposing parties both ally, both of them will gain points. But successfully betraying someone who votes ally grants even more points, while the betrayed will lose some. If both parties try to betray, the points will just remain the same. This has many interesting implications and is an ideal situation to bring forth a lot of mind games among the participants. Ideally, everyone will just ally all the time and eventually they leave together and all is well. But while voting, the characters will have to examine their trust for people they don't even know. Some might become greedy for the extra points of a successful betrayal. And since you never lose points if you choose betray, some might vote that way just to protect themselves. As you can imagine, the number of possible outcomes from each voting have many more ramifications than simply choosing a door a few times, like in 999. This is the reason why the developers introduced a very important interface element to complement the interactivity, the flowchart. At any point in Virtue's Last Reward, you can open the menu and check which exact route you're currently playing. how it connects to the others, and most importantly, jump to any of the many checkpoints within the branching paths. It is a really simple addition, but one that is absolutely necessary for the way how Virtue's Last Reward is set up. In the original version of 999, there was no such flowchart, and you basically had to play through the entire game again to see another route. And even then, some combinations of different choices would lead to the same endings. Getting all the endings in the original 999 could become quite a chore. Although you were able to fast forward dialogue that you had already seen, it was still rather slow to get through, and you could not skip any puzzle sections, forcing you to play through them again. Most people, like me, ended up looking for guides to check what choices were exactly necessary to obtain the missing endings. Of course, this is not an ideal situation, and in later versions of 999 on iOS and Steam, a flowchart like the one in Virtue's Last Reward was included. However, I think this is where one of the biggest flaws of the flowchart setup becomes apparent. You see, if you start playing 999 going in completely blind, you find yourself in this very tense life or death situation, and you feel like your choices have a lasting impact on the fate of the characters. But once you know that Junpei can retain information from one route to another, the game changes from being a bunch of what-if scenarios to a single stretch towards the one true ending. Don't get me wrong, if the narrative is constructed accordingly, this can still be a very satisfying way of wrapping up your story. And in my opinion, 999 totally achieves that. But there is something lost in the process, which is the feeling that your choice mattered. Now what you are doing is just trying out different alternatives to construct the story in an apparently non-linear way, taking bits and pieces from each of the different routes that you try out, but really you end up building a straight line. Sure, the order in which you take the pieces to form the line might be your choice, but apart from that you are now following a linear path towards one true ending. One example of a game where your choices matter much more is Undertale. Here the main hook is that you can choose to either fight and kill enemies like you would in any other RPG, or to figure out how to get out of the battle peacefully, resulting in a combination of puzzle solving and dodging lots and lots of attacks. And the great thing is that there's no clear branching point here. You can go through the game without killing anyone, killing half of the enemies, killing only one boss, or killing only one random enemy. And the game makes sure that you have a different experience for each of these scenarios. Aside from different ending sequences and unique bosses for each route, the NPCs will react to you in different ways depending on your behavior throughout the game. Now, I'm not saying that Zero Escape should try to be more like Undertale. It shouldn't. Both of them are doing their own unique thing. But when you start 999, the natural expectation is a story where your choice matters, and only towards the end of the full experience you realize that this isn't really true, because the information from one route leads to advancing the other. And in fact, the routes are designed in such a way that you probably won't notice this until as late as possible. 999 has 6 different endings, but you only need to get one of them, let's call it the key ending, to achieve the true ending that wraps up the whole story. But because of the way the branching paths are designed, it is highly likely that the key ending won't be among the first 2 you find. At the beginning of the game, before making any decisions, Junpei gets to know the remaining cast and recognizes a girl he knows from elementary school. It is rather obvious that Junpei has feelings for her. Now, the very first choice in the game is if you want to go through door number 4, where you will be together with Junpei's love interest, or door number who cares, I want to see if these two end up making out. So yeah, the game tempts you hard to choose door number 4 first. And guess what? The key ending is actually in a route that starts with the other door. So your first route will very likely not be the key ending, but also probably not your second either, because many players will tend to change only the last choice in the second playthrough, one of the final doors later down the line, since that would seem a plausible decision to avoid whatever disaster ensued in the last ending. So 999 deliberately delays the big reveal to keep you in the shadows, and gives you this tense feeling that you're not in control of the situation. But when the re-release of the game dumps the flowchart on you from the beginning, a big part of that is kinda lost. It trivializes the decision making, and now you're just trying out one choice after another and reading the story in your custom order. However, Virtue's Last Reward fully embraces this style of progressing through the game, and was written with this exact philosophy in mind, hence the many branching points with the voting system. This is why 999's final flowchart looks like this, while the one in Virtue's Last Reward is this big boy over here. It isn't really important if you, the player, wants to ally or betray a certain character, but rather you want to see what kind of situation arises if you choose one or the other. What is going to happen this time? Is that person gonna backstab me? Did we both try to outsmart each other? And what happened in the other votings? It becomes quite addicting and allows for developing and exploring the behavior of the game's characters in many kinds of situations. There's one especially cool moment where Virtue's Last Reward pulls a very clever trick using the interactivity of games. So usually when you vote to ally or betray the opposing party and then you go back to try the other option, you expect your opponent to vote the same both times, since the initial conditions are the same. However, at one point in the game, the unthinkable happens. First you voted to ally and they betray you, so on your second try you go back to vote betray to protect yourself, but oh no, now they're voting ally. They even get angry at you when you betrayed them, even though they did exactly the same to you in the other route. The protagonist, Sigma, who at this point is already aware that he can jump between timelines, is completely perplexed. The cool detail here is one that most players won't even notice. The order of how you choose your votes doesn't matter. If you start getting betrayed, Sigma will remember just that and will present this as his excuse for betraying back the second time around. But if you start betraying, he will complain about getting betrayed back at the next try, because his experience in the other timeline told him the other person would ally. It's great stuff to throw you off guard. As we established before, starting from the second game, Virtue's Last Reward, the Zero Escape series is built upon the foundation of a flowchart. This is also where a very important new aspect arises, the logs. Earlier I gave you an example from 999 where you needed the information of Route A to progress further in Route B. This now happens everywhere in the next two games, so logs are introduced as an interface element in the flowchart to signalize these situations. The most basic log is just telling you, hey, you just finished this, so go back there, you will have a new option now. Raging Loop, for example, another interesting visual novel that relies heavily on its flowchart, does exactly that. And while this is completely functional, it is also a rather boring solution and makes it feel much more like just an audio-visual choose-your-own-adventure book. Virtue's Last Reward is a little more engaging with the idea, and the logs usually require you to know a certain password that you then input yourself in the logged route. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it involves you as the player a bit more in the process. Now, the last game, Zero Time Dilemma, goes much wilder with the idea. In fact, Zero Time Dilemma is, in general, the most experimental one in the trilogy, with respect to unique storytelling in games. And sadly, it's also the worst written. You see, the very existence of Zero Time Dilemma is already a miracle. Although you would probably describe 999 as a very Japanese game, it wasn't precisely a commercial success in Japan. This did not become any better with Virtue's Last Reward, which, although released on double the platforms at launch day, only achieved approximately half the sales in its first year with respect to 999 in Japan. Director and writer Kotaro Uchikoshi said that the success of 999 in North America was part of the reason why the sequel of Virtue's Last Reward could be developed. Incidentally, the original 999 never actually had a European release, despite other text-heavy games without any translation to European languages besides English making it to that market. The sequels and later re-releases of 999 were indeed made available in Europe, but at the time it seemed like Virtue's Last Reward simply did not sell enough, which was a problem because it was already produced as the second game of the new Zero Escape Trilogy brand and therefore ended on a pretty huge cliffhanger. It was the kind of game that you just finished at 3 AM in the morning after marathoning for 9 hours and you already need the sequel. Many Western fans seem to think alike, and from their desire to play the conclusion to the Zero Escape trilogy, Operation Bluebird was born. In 2014, 2 years after the release of Virtue's Last Reward, Kotaro Uchikoshi created his English Twitter account where he spoke about his struggles with making the third Zero Escape game a reality, due to the insufficient commercial success of the previous titles. Operation Bluebird was a united effort of the Zero Escape fandom in response to that, posting tons of fan art, pictures of the Zero Escape collections, and cosplay, in order to show the love and support for the franchise, in hopes of proving that the third game would indeed be worth a financial input. In 2015, the dream became true, and it was announced that the development on the third game had resumed, later to be called Zero Time Dilemma and released on 3DS, PlayStation Vita and Steam in 2016. The rocky development history reflected on the quality of the final game, which is by far the most divisive of the franchise. However, what is interesting is that Zero Time Dilemma did not simply become a bad Virtue's Last Reward. The game did a lot of things quite different from its predecessors, and was rather ambitious in its concepts. On the surface, you would first notice the cinematic approach to the story sections, which, due to the low quality of the 3D models and animation, and rather poor lip-syncing to the voiceover, already didn't look stellar when the game launched, and has now simply aged terribly. But what I would like to highlight is how Zero Time Dilemma took a shot at the most unusual way of storytelling in the Zero Escape series. The flowchart returns again, but instead of playing through full branching paths, the story is now presented in fragments. The cast of 9 characters is divided into 3 teams, C, D and Q, separated from each other. And for each of these teams, you have a menu screen that shows you all currently available fragments. These fragments can be played in any order across all 3 teams, maximizing your choice of the order in which you play the game's events. After finishing certain sets of fragments, new ones become available, acting as the most basic type of lock that you encounter in the game. Fragments generally feature 3 elements: cutscenes, an escape room puzzle section, and a decision game. The decision games are usually some kind of moral choice, or an attempt at making the best guess in a probability-based conundrum, which give you the branching paths inside each fragment. Continuing with the philosophy of having narrative and interactivity working in symbiosis, the fragment system is also translated to the story. Each fragment starts when the 3 characters of the chosen team awake, and then they have 90 minutes to escape from a certain room and make a choice in the decision game, before being put to sleep again, erasing any memories of what happened during the time in the process. Just like the player, the characters have no way of knowing what events occurred before their awakening, and experience each of these 90-minute sessions in a vacuum. Of course, the player does retain the memories of the fragments that they have gone through previously, which provides an additional layer of fun to try and guess the connection between fragments while playing them. After finishing a fragment, its placement in the global flowchart is revealed, confirming or debunking the player's suspicions. The fragment system is unlike anything I have experienced in any other video game, but it bears a lot of negative consequences, which sadly outweigh the creative storytelling that the game produces. For one, experiencing dramatic moments like the deaths of certain characters in a vacuum and completely out of order reduces the emotional impact a lot. The objective for the participants in Zero Time Dilemma is to escape from the facility by killing 6 other participants, with the death of each revealing one of the 6 passwords needed to open the door to freedom. The opportunity to kill, be it accidentally or on purpose, usually arises with the decision games, which therefore are supposed to put the player in the place of making extreme choices in extreme situations. However, hearing the death announcements over and over again in different fragments from the viewpoint of different teams, and not knowing the full causal relationship between events until the end, undermines the significance of those individual circumstances. I must say though that the fault does not lie entirely with the fragment system. Zero Time Dilemma has a general problem of building up momentum, in developing its characters, its morality problems, or even the conclusion of the story. Splitting the cast into 3 teams that barely interact with each other takes away a lot of the charm from having different personalities clash and relationships evolve with time, like you would find in the previous games. In fact, I would argue that it is very hard to care about most of the game's characters and their interactions if it were not because you played the previous 999 and Virtue's Last Reward. To a certain extent, the developers even seem to be aware of that. Remember how I talked about the difference in deaths for pure shock effect and the deaths for drama in 909? Well, Zero Time Dilemma dialed up the gore to the max, all with chainsaws, machine guns, dismemberments, bone-melting acids, and Tarantino-esque blood cascades. Apparently, the shock effect has now become the main purpose or value that the game has to offer, which is mirrored in its story that relies too much on the presence of shocking twists without much substance in between. Following the trend of Virtue's Last Reward, the escape room sections are even more disconnected from the main story, if you could firmly identify a main story, and most times they only serve to set up the situation of the eventual decision game. Uchikoshi said that there were some philosophical concepts that he wanted to explore in Virtue's Last Reward, which he was not able to integrate in the end, and you can really notice that all of them were dumped onto their own dedicated fragments in Zero Time Dilemma, without being as cleverly connected to the main game's theme as in the previous cases. Okay, I have been very harsh with the game now, but there are actually many more elements that make Zero Time Dilemma an interesting experimental precedent for visual novels. Some of the locks are more creative and involve the player more meaningfully than in Virtue's Last Reward. Instead of just telling you, type in the number combination 69420, certain passwords are related to the story and must be inferred correctly by the player given the information they have. None of these instances in Zero Time Dilemma are really challenging, but they still provide a feeling of interaction that is much more satisfying. Some other locks require you to input names of characters whose identity you don't know yet or you're being tricked about, and the game will respond to certain choices with confusing messages that will later make sense once you know the whole truth. There's one optional lock in the game in particular that blows every player's minds if they think of trying out a certain option once they know about it, foreshadowing one of the game's biggest reveals. In some of the probability-based decision games, the probability is rigged in order to create a certain effect for how the player experiences the story, but in other situations the probabilities are real, completing the illusion for the player. The game even uses a fake good ending at the very start in order to throw the player off guard and then exploits it to reiterate on the global theme. All three games in the Zero Escape trilogy excel at capitalizing on your assumptions as a player of what you know about the game, or think to know, and turn these assumptions on the head in groundbreaking plot reveals. Sometimes it is the fact that you are playing on a dual-screen console, sometimes it is the first-person perspective, sometimes it is even the pre-release marketing. Devices like these trick you into believing that you are aware of certain elements, but in truth you aren't. And I would dare say that Zero Time Dilemma had the boldest version with the best interactive integration of these devices. Credit where credit is due. So, wrapping up this little exploration of the visual novel genre through the lens of the Zero Escape series, let's go back to the fundamentals with a question. Should visual novels even be considered video games? Some people would say no, since you are mostly just reading through a story and they have little pure gameplay. Kotaro Uchikoshi himself offered an interesting take on this in his GDC talk in 2013. He said that games can be defined as things with selectivity, where the actions of the player influence the outcome or the events within a certain set of rules. The Last of Us is a game because by killing zombies you ensure the survival of Joel and Ellie. Tetris is a game because the way you arrange the blocks results in either high towers or cleared lines. Chess is a game because your actions determine who wins the match. In that sense, visual novels not only are games, but they are the most primitive, essential form of games, because the whole emphasis lies on the player's choices affecting the narrative. You might argue about the impact or the significance of the player's choices in some visual novels, but this is a design philosophy that is definitely the signature of Uchikoshi's works. In his last game, The Somnium Files, again a visual novel, he and his team played it much safer, and the storytelling interactivity symbiosis isn't as ambitious or clever as in Zero Time Dilemma. The flowchart is back again in but here the big hook is the Somnium, an explorable dream with time management and puzzle elements, paired with the unpredictable nature of the human psyche. While interesting, it feels far more like a standard video game mechanic that doesn't really get to the meta level of gaming interactivity. The Somnium Files is very well written and has an amazing art style, bless you Kozaki, and might very well be my favorite Uchikoshi game. But I really hope that someday Uchikoshi or maybe someone else takes the precedents established by Zero Time Dilemma, polishes the formula and takes it to the next level. We need people who defy the very notion of what a game is. Hey, guess what? You just saw my very first video ever. That's amazing, or well, at least for me it's very huge, and I am grateful for every single person who gives me a chance here, and especially if you watched through this whole thing until the end and you're hearing me right now. So yeah, I'm just getting started with this, and I would love to do more and better content on video games for you, so please leave me any feedback you have in the comments, like or dislike the video, and subscribe to my channel if you want to see what else I want to show you in the future. Thank you so much for watching and have an excellent day. Don't let the person in the gas mask get you.